Hello? Right, okay. As Loz said, I'm an architect. If you go to our website, you will see this. This is what you see on most architects' kind of website. I'm going to read it out. It's YN Studio, which is the name of our practice, is an architecture practice based in London. We ask questions about the site and brief to maximise their potential. The questions are always complex, but a successful answer should be as simple as a yes or no. Obviously, the Y in the end from yes or no is why we're called YN Studio. And we work at all scales across all sectors and in any location. But what the hell does that mean, I think, is what most people see when they go to websites. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity for us to talk about our process, and that's what I'm going to do now. So I think before I talk about some of our projects, there are a couple of things I want to talk about. Firstly, the difference between a kind of pragmatic approach and an idealistic approach. So a pragmatic architect would kind of work with the context. They would, build simple vernacular forms, use natural materials. That might seem like a really good thing in most contexts. But the trouble is, as that kind of grows, that leads to kind of big boxes, essentially, as the kind of technology increases in its efficiency. And the whole project is kind of derived from maximizing value and increasing efficiency. A pragmatic architect might think about the environment, but they probably wouldn't make the project give anything back. They would just substitute normal materials. So this is a project I worked on years and years ago. We built the whole thing out of timber rather than concrete. It's more sustainable, but building a building is still kind of bad for the environment all in all. And this is a perfect, hopefully none of you guys live in this house, but this is a kind of, pragmatism can kind of limit ambition. So this is a permitted development scheme. This means you don't even need an architect or you don't even need to get planning permission, sorry. So you can build any box on the back of your building, and you can build a loft extension as long as you match the materials. Obviously that has disastrous impacts on the quality we think of the building. And then on the other side of the coin, you've got kind of idealism and ambition. So, an ambitious architecture would kind of promote culture and define places. Who would have thought that a kind of wheel would become something that people actually go and visit and use? So it's kind of innovative and forward thinking. In opposition to what I said earlier about sustainability, it would have a positive impact on the environment. It wouldn't just limit its impact, it would literally give back. So this is a waste to energy plant that's just opened in Copenhagen. It literally takes waste and turns it into energy. But obviously it can go wrong. Sometimes you can get kind of too close to the sun, buildings become too expensive, or bridges become too expensive. They become politicized, and they can become victims of their own success before they're even built. So I guess rather than do one or the other, because we think there are kind of fallbacks to both, our practice tries to do both, essentially. So what we do is we kind of ask as many questions of our clients, the site, the brief, the planning context, identify as many challenges as we can, and then we solve all of those challenges as best as we possibly can. And if we can, we look for opportunities to add even more value to the project. So I think by combining both of those, that's, I guess, where we get the most interesting work. When we present our work, we often use these kind of questions. The answer is always yes, obviously. But so I won't dwell on the questions. Instead, I'm just going to talk through diagrams that explain what the problems were and then how we solve them. So this is a project that we're doing for Folkestone Council. So it's 4-number holiday homes. The site's amazing. The trouble is we don't get to be able to see it. So our site is obviously at the front here. We're along a street, but we're blocked by a kind of landmass about a story high and then 2 reasonably ugly buildings, but the view is incredible behind them. So how do you kind of solve a problem? So the client insisted on 4 separate houses, but we looked to try and sculpt the forms to essentially maximize the oblique views looking at the sea. We wanted to make south-facing terraces that look towards Dungeness. This is about 10 kilometers away from Dungeness. And we worked with a really good landscape architect to try and make sure that we can kind of make our scheme blend into the landscape and almost give you direct access to the beach. A typical response in this case would almost provide problematic areas where at the ground floor, because it might flood, you'd just be utility spaces, bedrooms in the middle, and then a living space at the top. The trouble is the living space wouldn't be big enough. So one of the key drivers we discovered in this project is how we can shift the floor plates to essentially make a spiral of spaces. Each one's about a desk height different, about as high as the back of that chair. And what that means is we can make one continuous open plan space for a living area, which is bigger than the sum of the individual floor plate of the building. It's hard to understand that, so I will try and explain when you see the spaces. And obviously, because these are holiday homes, each one is going to be differentiated by material, by the way that the windows are positioned, and so on. So this is the kind of materials we're proposing. This is due to be constructed at some point next year. So when I first went to the site, I literally picked up stones. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. And we discovered that in our office, we've got hundreds of timber samples, and we basically could match the colours almost exactly to the kind of colours of the stone and create this kind of gradient pattern. So what you will get, hopefully in about a year's time, maybe a bit longer, 18 months, is this kind of 4 homes that you can see from the beach. This is looking back towards the building. They look quite odd and unusual, but they're actually completely, the language is derived entirely from the process and entirely from trying to solve as many problems as we can. So this is the kind of slope that I was talking about. So you're actually quite deep when you're at ground floor. That's a kind of garden access utility space. And right at the top there, you've got a terrace and a living space. I'm going to go quite quickly through these, but a lot of energy goes into making the images. The view you'll get from the top is amazing. And those are the buildings we're trying to avoid looking at, by the way. So you shouldn't, in many of the houses, you should get at least one uninterrupted view. And in most cases, because of the way we place the furniture, you'll look straight beyond those buildings. Some of the split level spaces that we create with the plan. And almost framing some of the views of the buildings that we're not so fond of, we think could be interesting too. Okay, so that was a building that's basically entirely driven by trying to make the most interesting spaces possible to sell, to kind of work with the site. This one's more about the limitation of the client. So this is in, I don't know if anyone knows Gillette Square in Hackney. So it's just behind Dalston Kingland. So our client owns the buildings behind, and they also help to manage the square. So they're an affordable workspace provider. They're a not-for-profit organisation. And so we were asked to refurbish those spaces because they will be forced to, the tenants, if they leave, they're not allowed to replace them because they're not up to scratch in terms of energy efficiency. So we love these, the market pods which are there, but unfortunately they are not, they don't work. So what we've done is we've met with every single tenant and we looked at ways to try and refurbish the building, keep as many people in place as possible, and not kind of not damage the square and the unique qualities of the square. So again, I'm going to go quite quickly through this, but first step is to make sure that we look after everyone. So all of those market tenants, I think NTS Radio is one of them, are going to move across into a temporary home. We then, in terms of the building and the architecture, the things that basically will become the background to the square, what we did is look at reusing as much of the building fabric as possible, make it more insulated, upgrade it, replace the windows as much as possible. But we need to remove the roof. Obviously, this is a huge extension. So instead, we sculpt the form. Again, going back to that kind of pragmatic hut, the simplest, most efficient form is normally a pitched roof. It's the best value you can make. The structure is a super kind of simple steel frame which rests on the existing brick structure. We're wrapping it in a lightweight, cost-effective facade of polycarbonate. And so in summary, you take an existing building, which used to be a terraced house, became affordable workspace about 20 years ago, add a kind of lightweight extension, which pays, due to the new rents on the bit on the top, it will pay for the other bits. We make a lot of models in the studio as we're working. This one's yay big. And then at night, the idea is that we've got this thing will glow because the plastic cladding is kind of translucent. So this is a CGI of what it will look like. This one is about to start on site, hopefully January next year. Yeah, so what we're doing is we're re-providing the pods which exist, so people will be allowed to move back in there, and then that temporary workspace will either be removed or be reinstated and used, and therefore we get kind of 3 sides of the square rather than 2. That's an example of the kind of new mezzanine space at the top which we're making. So it's actually external. This is the easiest way we can find to extend the building, because actually the space on top is where the where they most need the space. All of those are refurbished spaces on the right hand side. And then this part is actually constructed. I can show you some pictures. We wanted to limit the impact of having essentially kind of small pods which were only temporary. So we proposed this kind of deck that would be built on top. Frustratingly, the client, this is one of our kind of Icarus moments, the client didn't have enough money for it because it was temporary. So they built it without the roof. And we really hope that one day people fall in love with these and we get to build the deck on top later. We kind of call it the Dalston deck in our office, but I don't think that will catch on. So this has been built. These are not, we like to make slick buildings. This is not slick, this is a temporary building. But the idea is the pod tenants will use these for a year and then move back into a much nicer home. And we were really interested in doing some public art, but we realized as soon as we put them up, we didn't need to, because Dalston did deliver, and no doubt it looks even better than that now and is covered. So the idea is all of the tenants will house their signage on the inside of the doors, so in the daytime it will look much more exciting than that. That's it in its closed condition. The next project, those two were the main case studies. I'm going to kind of rattle quickly through some other ideas that we did recently. So this is a museum or a kind of cultural centre in Norfolk, in the Norfolk Broads. So the challenge for this one was that the client basically didn't have enough money to do what they wanted to do. So they owned 3 buildings. They asked us to demolish all of those and build a big fancy headquarters for a budget that we didn't think was realistic. So our first move is to not demolish 2 of the buildings and instead build 2 separate ones, 2 separate brand new buildings. This means they can reduce their running costs by only having the buildings they need open in the summer and not using the ones they don't need in the winter. We wanted to connect those 2 new buildings, and obviously the best way to learn about the Norfolk Broads and to experience it is to be outside. So a lot of it is kind of outdoor learning spaces that we're investigating, and a kind of path which we would like to be a kind of natural pathway through. Connecting to the water as well, kayaking, that kind of thing, and then cladding it in timber. We use a lot of timber in the office at the moment, but maybe if the budget's increased, we might propose some slightly more expensive finishes. So the idea is this is 2 buildings, but it looks like one. It's quite iconic, but it's low. You can climb the building, and crucially, you can kind of learn about the Broads in it and kind of connect the 2 in the summer so that it almost works like one building. Right, another one. So we can take our approach and apply it to a bridge or to any kind of project because it's, I guess, scalable. We can do small projects, we can do big projects. When we were asked to look at a railway bridge, so this is a standard Network Rail footbridge, we realised that there are a couple of problems. One is that they're ugly. And they have been for the last 50 years. The second one is that they don't really do anything. They allow you to cross, normally getting wet while you're doing it. So really simply, we came up with an idea of making the bridge a waiting area and trying to make it reference the kind of historical railway architecture that I think is great in Britain, that has not been kind of prevalent other than in central London in big stations, certainly not in railway footbridges. And so it's basically a girder bridge built in sections, but turned inside out. And so you'll get this kind of waiting area that allows you to see your bridge your train, approaching, and you can kind of watch your times. Quick idea. We're doing a house at the moment in Walthamstow for a friend. It's been going on for a little while, but going back again to that earlier example of what you do if you've got a house like this and you need a loft and a rear extension. So our approach in this case was to look at a different way of doing it, essentially. So to try and reference the original architecture, i.e. the angles of the roof. If you extend the angles of the roof, people can't see your extension, and then if we fold it back to be a version of what the kind of simple one would have been, that what you get essentially is a kind of area which is dramatically bigger, but still complies with all the regulations. So this is a kind of example of using the rules, which are too boring for me to explain to you, against the kind of planning department, for want of a better word. So our client was over the moon because what they got is a 6-meter extension with a 4.5-meter pitch inside. This is what it should look like, and this is what it currently looks like. So it's nearly done. We'll be publishing it soon. You can apply our logic to public spaces. This one's a really simple one. This is in Lanzarote, in the Canary Islands, so in the capital city, which is called Arrecife. The brief was, we need to make a public space, please help us. They really don't need a public space. What they need is a water collection kind of cylinder, and that's that green, that blue bit there. So we literally decided to collect, our whole design is about collecting the water, so we just proposed 10 funnels, essentially, which collect all the rainwater, make that the water tank work better, and then we use that to kind of plant luscious gardens around them. So in this case, what we get is lots of shaded seating areas, 10 different scales of circular space, which allow you to either have a cafe or kind of one-off seating or all sorts of different things in between. And the idea, we called it Plaza Circular, which is circle square, obviously. And then, so the idea is in the day, you're shaded by the trees. It's obviously very hot there, but at night, that central space will come alive. They have gigs and things. We're all obviously interested in, how much time have I got, Loz? Am I all right? I've got 3 left, I think. I'll be quick. So this is a very quick one. So we were asked to look at how you could get, how you could kind of help homeless people. There's a big problem in London, everywhere really, of hidden homeless people between the ages of 16 and 21. This project was run by a charity. And so they wanted us to find ways of almost funding shelters using other typologies. So this is a co-working workspace, not a million miles away from what we have here, with a homeless shelter on top and then a kind of exchange zone in the middle. So one of the biggest problems that young people who are temporarily homeless have is that they don't really have a kind of good support network, and maybe they don't have the same kind of role models. So the idea is you would get subsidized rent for your co-working desk as long as you give time back to the people who are in the shelter, and there's this kind of safe exchange zone in the middle. And so you get a kind of section that looks like this. And 2 big ones. So we do bigger projects as well as smaller ones. A client approached us and asked us to look at Hounslow West, which I guess is not far from here. There isn't much in the way of scale in Hounslow West at the moment. It's quite low rise. But what happened was the planning department realised that one client happened to own all of the important buildings. They owned all the land. And they kept throwing in these tiny little planning applications for single-storey extensions. And they said, look, help us to consider what would happen if we tried to redesign a town centre for Hounslow West. And so they wanted a lot of different uses in there. And so very simply, we knew that we needed to provide a bigger building maybe than the area requires. So how do you do that? What we wanted to do was make these kind of ziggurat forms to make sure that we can provide something to give back to the public in return for this scale. So the ziggurat forms mean that the neighbours won't be as affected, and we also provide kind of public terraces. We make a big model again. And so you would get this kind of pretty tall building, but it's neither a kind of tall, thin building or a long, low building. It's kind of both. And the terraces are what we hopefully would become kind of public. I think there's a kind of wedding venue in there as well. That was at least the plan. This is not happening, this one, unfortunately. And that's a nursery as well, which is shaped around a tree, which was already there. Okay, final one. So has anyone been to Hull? Or is from Hull? Okay, good. So this is a competition in Hull. So the planners have developed this scheme, which we don't like. And the competition was, how can we make this better? And how can we, I guess, reconnect Hull to the water? So the existing plan is just kind of standard streets, all parallel roads facing the water. The trouble is that this bit at the bottom here literally is kind of covered in ugly kind of industrial buildings, so you won't be looking at the water in most of those streets. So really simply, we just made as few streets as possible and made as much building as possible. This is all housing, by the way. The retail is in other places. And so the idea here is that we would be able to make boulevards because we're making less linear meters of street, but they can all be wider and more generous. We thought it was an opportunity for height to kind of almost define the skyline of Hull as well. So we proposed really simple towers. Given that the land value in Hull is not what it is around here, we need to kind of make something which is simple to build and cost effective to build. And then we worked with a great landscape architect to try and green the kind of side of the Humber. And so the only thing which is accurate in this model is the colour of the water, because it is brown, because it's an estuary, basically, the Humber. So it's really interesting. It goes up by kind of 7 or 8 meters, just like the Thames does. And so we make these big models to kind of test the ideas. And the idea is you'll get this kind of really iconic form as you approach Hull, but actually it's pretty simple and straightforward to construct. And that is it. That's how we work. Thank you.